Good evening. All right, we're on board. So welcome to the regular meeting of our City Planning Commission, Thursday, March 10th, 2016, Brisbane City Hall, and we're at 50 Park Place in Brisbane. Could I have roll call, please?
Commissioner Anderson?
Present.
Commissioner Manier?
Here.
Commissioner Parker?
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Here.
The record reflect Commissioner Doe is absent.
Yeah, and on that note, I'd like to just add that Chairperson Doe is absent for happy reasons. She had a baby on Sunday afternoon, so she's not expected to be here until probably the end of next month. So we all wish her well and the family and many hours of sleep as possible. Okay, tonight's agenda. So may we have a motion to adopt tonight's agenda, please?
A motion to adopt the agenda of Thursday, March 10th, 2016 of the Brisbane Planning Commission.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you. All right, so the consent calendar. So just to note, the items listed here, which are draft action minutes from previous prior meetings, February 7th and 11th, or 2nd and 11th, sorry, will be acted upon by one motion adopting the planning department's recommendation unless someone from the public or the commission or its staff asks to remove an item to discuss it. Does anyone wish to remove an item from the consent calendar?
No.
Good?
No, but I can't vote in one action because
Right,
I was absent for the second one.
Right. And no
You can
problem.
have an absentee vote.
Yeah. All right. Can we have a motion to adopt consent calendar as listed, please?
I make a motion to adopt the consent calendar as listed here, or as presented here.
I second that.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Great. Okay. Next item, oral communications. So just to clarify, so a friendly reminder that this section of the agenda is for items not on tonight's calendar. There's a 15-minute limit for any items that someone wants to speak about that are not on tonight's agenda. Is there anyone that wants to speak on items not on tonight's agenda? No. Okay. And to know, after deliberations, I received your speaker note cards here, requests. There will be time given, 3 minutes for each person, or up to 3 minutes after our deliberations. So thank you for turning these in. And you're welcome to turn these in until that time. Okay. Written communications. So for the record, we've got letter dated March 7th, received on the 10th from the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Okay, let's going to list who they are. And we've got a letter from the Greenbelt Alliance. We also have a letter from Ron Kilconey. Hopefully I pronounced that properly. Thank you, Ron. We've also received a letter from Mark Moulton, and he's the former executive director of Peninsula Habitat for Humanity. Thank you, Mark. We've also received a letter from Corey Smith. Most of these are regarding tonight's topic, of course. We've also received a letter from Spur, so that's dated the 9th. And we've received also a letter from San Mateo County Economic Development Association, dated today, and also from Matt Reagan, the Senior Vice President, Bay Area Council. Thank you for all those submissions. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Oh, and also I just wanted to note, Chris Hart, you're not able to stay till. Sorry? Okay, oh, great, you're staying. Okay, thank you. All right. Now, old business. Okay, so we are all here tonight for the planning Baylands Planning Application GP-01006 and related final environmental impact report with Universal Paragon as the owner with various other owners and parcel numbers. Is that sufficient? Yeah.
Yes, and again, this is just continued deliberations. I'll turn the presentation over to Lloyd Zola.
And tonight I get to do only part of the presentation because Dr. Susan Mearns is here and she'll talk about the remediation process. At our last meeting we talked about a lot of different land uses at the Baylands, so tonight will be very easy because we're only talking about one land use. But this one realistically, as we talk about housing on the Baylands and that potential, that is of course one of the most controversial parts of this entire process. The question for tonight is a very straightforward one, although the discussion may not be and the issues are very great. And that is, should residential use within the Baylands be further explored as you go through your subsequent planning and environmental policy decisions? So this is not a final decision. Remember, until we get to the actual decision at the end, the actual recommendation, everything is subject to re-review as we go through later in more detail other issues dealing with the Baylands, and we will actually go back into actual policies regarding site remediation. The reason we're going to discuss site remediation tonight is that it's so tied up with residential that, and the possibility of residential, you can't discuss one without the other. And so what we'll discuss tonight, we're aiming at that one question, and then we'll follow up in later discussions regarding your recommendations on actual policies for the general plan regarding site remediation. The basic principle that you establish in your very first deliberation meeting, one of them, is that ensure that the site is safe for the future uses approved for development by the city. So any discussion that you may have looking at should we not have housing within the Baylands is really based on meeting this principle. So therefore, any residential use within the Baylands is going to be based on, if you recommend residential, based on a requirement that the site is made safe both during construction and in the long term. So part of what you're going to end up thinking about tonight is, can that actually be accomplished? So the basic issues that we'll look at tonight and talk about in relation to that question about housing for the Baylands. Safety and site remediation. We'll look at the existing general plan policy that prohibits housing within the Baylands. We'll look at community survey results. What is the role of housing in a sustainable development within the Baylands? What is the role of housing in environmental considerations? How does inclusion or not inclusion of housing kind of change the environmental equation? What is the overall need for housing? I think a lot of the letters that you have in front of you talk about need for housing. What are the effects of the residential being proposed in the Baylands on community character? And finally, what does residential mean for the city's bottom financial line, money coming in and out? So first we'll talk about safety and site remediation, and actually Dr. Mearns will do this part. So let me.
Okay. So there are two portions of the property that are under State of California Regulatory Agency oversight. One of them is Operable Unit 1 and one of them is Operable Unit 2. The State of California Environmental Protection Agency has multiple different regulatory agencies. One of them is the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and one of them is the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Boards. Basically, the state has been divided up into different regions for the water quality control boards. This particular area falls under the oversight of the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board. So you've heard Lloyd talk about the issue of safety and how it's intertwined with remediation. And that's something that the regulatory agencies also are looking at relative to how do you remediate property, land, and or groundwater and or surface water so that it is safe not only for the future intended use, but for the construction workers and for the adjacent individuals surrounding the property. And the best way to do that is actually to perform a human health risk assessment. And that risk assessment is done to these strict standards. It is reviewed by degreed professionals in the regulatory agencies. The DTSC has an office called the Health and Ecological Risk Office. They go by the acronym of HERO. The regional water quality control boards, they don't have their own in-house office, but they use another agency within the California Environmental Protection Agency called the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and they sit up in Sacramento. And these individuals then will receive risk assessments that would be produced by the applicant or the developer. Typically, a consultant will produce the risk assessment. It will then be reviewed by these regulatory agencies to meet very strict standards, and then it's actually peer reviewed within the regulatory agency itself prior to the regulatory agency opining on the validity of the risk assessment. One of the other things that these regulatory agencies will do is they'll actually oversee the physical site remediation, and they will certify that there's completion of remediation. But the role of the regulatory agencies is not finished once remediation has been achieved. So regulatory agencies, oops. Yeah, I hit the bottom button. Thanks. Thank you. So the regulatory agencies, once remediation has been achieved, are still able to come back to the site if it looks like there is potential for contamination to migrate off of that property, or if there are new chemicals that are discovered from undertaking other cleanup actions on other properties that would lead them to believe that those particular chemicals might be associated with this particular project. So they can actually reopen the entire assessment investigation process even after they have certified that remediation is complete. So part of the process when you start is to actually look at the body of work that's been performed. So the regulatory agencies will be reviewing all of the investigations and assessments that have been performed on the property. They will be determining whether or not they are adequate to characterize the site, to get an understanding of the nature and extent of the contaminants. And then they will request that the human health risk assessment be performed by the applicant or the project developer, and then they will set risk-based cleanup goals. So the risk assessment will actually determine whether the site is safe for the future intended use and construction workers, and it can also be used to determine risk-based cleanup goals. So it will go through a series of mathematical equations and models that are very conservative in nature that end up providing a value for each chemical or constituent that's been detected in all of the different media that would tell the consultant that particular concentration, if you hit that target concentration, then that's the cleanup goal, and the site would be safe for the future intended use, whether it's residential or commercial industrial.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
So is it a foregone conclusion that they are going to eventually get to the point where they would certify any property as safe after a sufficient amount of remediation, or do they occasionally deem properties to be unfit for the intended use, and how often does that happen?
It's not a foregone conclusion that they will certify something as safe. It depends upon the particular medium that is trying to be addressed, and the constituent of concern. So, for example, something like soil vapor, where they put in a vapor extraction system, and so they are literally blowing air through interstitial pore spaces in the subsurface to move vapors in a direction where then they're extracting them. That this works very well, very quickly, within 18 months to 2 years, but then the process itself slows down. You have biodegradation occurring, and you just have the fact that you've removed the bulk of the contamination in that soil vapor that you can. So then you have to turn the system off, wait, and continue to try to remediate, but there is going to be, or there tends to be, a point where you just can't get all of it. You can't get any more. So then if you can't achieve that risk-based cleanup goal, does that mean that the site is not safe, or are there other mitigation measures that can be enacted? For something like we're discussing, which is soil vapor, there are vapor intrusion control methods which can be placed sub-slab. So anything that would be in close proximity to the former landfill on this property is going to have a methane mitigation system sub-slab. And the methane mitigation system can be designed to also mitigate any volatiles that are in the subsurface or in groundwater and would have the potential to migrate vertically into a structure. So even though, for example, then what we're talking about, if the cleanup goal couldn't be met for something like soil vapor, which is not atypical because it's so difficult to do the remediation as I've described it, there are these mitigation measures that would be enacted. So the regulatory agency would take that into consideration when they would make their determination as to whether or not remediation was complete for the property. For something like metals, which are not volatile, you're looking at excavation of metals, so you're looking at the excavation of soil. For something like total petroleum hydrocarbons, where you have...
Can you go through that again? Excavate, so you would take the soil off-site?
That's a possible remedial measure for...
I thought the laws had changed and we cannot take soil off, or only a certain amount of soil off.
If the risk-based cleanup goals indicate that there are concentrations of metals that pose a risk to human health, then one of the remedial strategies would be to remove that soil. So that in and of itself also has constraints. You have trucks now leaving the property. You have soil going someplace to either be treated or landfilled, but that is a remedial strategy. So if there are things like total petroleum hydrocarbons, they lend themselves to bioremediation, biodegradation, because it's a carbon chain and the microbes that actually live in the soil will consume the carbon chain as an energy source. So these are different remedial strategies that can be employed on both of the OU1, OU2, depending upon the contaminants, depending upon the risk-based cleanup goals, and depending upon the future intended use of the property. Does that answer your question?
I think the way I understand his question was, do you have the data from this agency that they have approved or disapproved the remedial methods that they use, and said that this particular site is not suitable for development? Are there any data available or statistics that show that how many times the agency has rejected, after doing all of those measures, Are there any sites where they say that, no, we cannot build on that site, or every single site, they have approved it? Is that the
Yeah, that was
question
sort
was?
of the gist of it.
So we like to find out this particular agency, what kind of records they have. Do they approve every single project after whatever the lengthy measures they take, and they say, okay, you go ahead and do it? Or they really clearly say that you cannot build on this site?
Well, the regulatory agencies aren't approving the project. They are approving the risk assessment, and they are approving the remedial action. So for constituents that are easily remediated, so when you take a confirmation sample, you've achieved that cleanup goal, then the approval is easy. For those constituents where it is more difficult to obtain the cleanup goal and mitigation measures would be required, the regulatory agencies might require different types of remediation to try to achieve that cleanup goal before they would agree that it's just not achievable and mitigation measures would have to be enacted. But they are not approving a project. They're approving a risk assessment.
That's what I was talking about. I'm not talking that they're going to approve the project, but the end result, they're going to recommend that it cannot be done. And then it's up to the city or whatever agency that go forward with the approval or disapproving that. So we were trying to figure out are there any instances where they say that no matter what you do, the cleanup cannot be done and cannot be met. And also the cleanup goals, who sets this up? Is that the agency or the joint committee of some sort that decides on that? And are they state mandated or federal mandated, or city can have their own?
The cleanup goals are determined by the risk assessment. Okay, so if we take a step back and look at a human health risk assessment, the risk assessment is done to state of California and federal standards. And again, it's reviewed by advanced degreed professionals in both DTSC and OEHA offices. And it uses models and formula, and it uses different variables that are mandated by these regulatory agencies. So the risk assessment will look at receptors, which are basically individuals. It's a hypothetical individual in a residential scenario where that hypothetical individual spends 30 years of his or her life on the property at a particular area on the property where the greatest detected concentration of the constituents are for 350 days a year, and that they will then be consuming the soil, if the constituents in the soil. They will be inhaling whatever is there at that particular point in time for 350 days a year for 30 years. So that's the conservative nature of a risk assessment so I'm assuming that there's a hypothetical individual that is exposed to this area on the property for 30 years, literally ingesting soil, literally touching soil, literally inhaling whatever's from that place for 350 days a year for 30 years.
And that's a mathematical model, right? It's
Yes.
not a real person.
That's correct. It's a hypothetical. Okay, so that's the basis of a residential risk assessment. And then by the time that we finish the equation and the model, you end up with a number that is 1 times something. The threshold value is 1 times 10 to the 6th, or 1 in a million. For a commercial scenario, the assumption is that it's a 250-day per year exposure for 25 years. Same thing, you would have the hypothetical worker who would be touching the dirt, ingesting the dirt, inhaling anything that came off the dirt for a maximum, where there was a maximum detected concentration of the constituent that you're looking for. And this calculation is done for each constituent. So let's suppose there were 50 constituents that were detected in soil, This calculation would be done for each of those constituents. So that's 50 equations, and then we sum those equations. So the very nature of a risk assessment is very conservative. This is also done for a construction worker. And by the time that the project were to move forward, irrespective of the end use of the property, remediation would have occurred. So the maximum concentration would be remediated. There will be surface level parking, there will be buildings, there will be mitigation measures in place. So by the time that the project actually gets developed, the material that the hypothetical individuals were potentially exposed to is gone. So again, that speaks to the very nature of the conservative nature of the risk assessment, irrespective of whether it's for the residential or the commercial scenario.
I have a question about the units on the risk of adverse effects.
Sure.
Is that per the entire study period or per year? I don't understand your question. When you say study period, because a risk assessment doesn't assume, it assumes that the carcinogenic effect of a chemical is 70 years. So again, let's think if you're residential, you're 30 years exposed to something. If it's commercial, it's 25 years. But the potential adverse effect from toxicological properties has a 70-year latency within the body. So it's not a study area or a year. It's looking at an incremental incidental increase of 1 chance in a population of 1 million for someone to potentially experience an adverse impact. It doesn't say that you will. It says it might. There's the potential that it would act as a trigger for an adverse impact. So if you had
over the life of the hypothetical individual.
Right, so if you had 1 million people living in a residential area for 30 years, you would expect 1, not 30 of them to potentially be.
To potentially have an incremental incidental increase. It doesn't say they will.
Right, statistically.
Right. And that again is after the entire conservative risk assessment where we've gone through this process for each constituent and then we've summed them.
Right.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
When you determine that, shouldn't that be determined based on the half-life of the particular elements that are in the soil, for example? Because some of the elements will have a much higher half-life period than the others. So, and also the second question is that in the equations, normally any kind of a model, there are a lot of variables involved where you assume certain factors in there, and how those are determined and who determines that, because any time you change any variable, it will have a totally different, and what kind of, how those variables are determined, and is there any study done that can back that up?
Sure. So the assumption is that there is no half-life. The assumption is that the maximum detected concentration, so look, if it's chemical A and it was detected 120 times in the soil, they would choose the greatest detected concentration out of 120 times. And they would not assume that it degrades or has a half-life. It's that concentration that that hypothetical is exposed to for 30 years or 25 years. Then with regard to the variables and the equations are actually set by the state of California. And the state of California is much more rigorous than the federal government. So OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, actually determines these threshold values, and they publish them. They're published in these human health risk assessment notes through DTSC's HERO office, and there is language that tells you how they came up with the thresholds, what studies were done, what toxicological information was reviewed, the peer review process itself within OEHA and within HERO before they even made these threshold values public. So, for example, there's a particulate emission factor. So that particulate emission factor is different for construction workers than it is for, again, a hypothetical construction worker, than it is for a hypothetical resident when I'm doing a risk assessment or consultants doing a risk assessment. And that value is set by OEHA. And when the risk assessment is produced, it is reviewed by OEHA if it was submitted to the water boards, or it's reviewed by HERO if it was submitted to DTSC. And those individuals will check to see if the correct threshold values were used, if the correct variables were used, if the correct equations were used. They will actually redo the math to see if they end up with the same result as what the consultant did. They will question anything, any assumptions that are not backed up by literature or toxicological information. They will generate comments if they disagree with the approach, if they disagree with whether or not the site has been adequately characterized, if they disagree with the choice of threshold values or even an equation. And they won't approve the risk assessment until it meets their criteria, their satisfaction.
Okay, now 1 in 1 million, 1 in 100,000, those were set by the EPA?
No, those are set by the state of California. EPAs are less than that. EPA,
Cali, EPA.
no, State of California Environmental Protection Agency.
Yes, Cali EPA.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a question.
sure.
Can you tell a little bit about the difference in the style of the two organizations, or is that not your?
Sure. So, DTSC typically is the lead agency when the constituents have impacted soils, not groundwater. However, they will remain the lead agency if groundwater has been affected by the soils, which would be considered a secondary source. Typically, the water board is the lead agency when groundwater has been identified as impacted first.
So I am confused. I thought that both of these organizations are going to be under the purview of the two different agencies. Is that correct? OU1 and OU2, or am I in?
Yeah, OU1 is being remediated under the oversight of DTSC.
Right.
OU2 is San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board.
And why are why is the two agencies? How did that happen? Do you have? Excuse me.
Just guessing it was Guadalupe Creek.
I don't know.
Specifically for this project, I don't know how that happens. Sometimes it can be the consultant will advise the client, this is a soils issue, you need to go to DTSC, or this is a groundwater issue, you need to go to the water board.
I see.
Anybody know?
That is a decision that was made probably, for my review of the files a while ago, is probably 20 years ago. And I think it was based on, to the extent of what they considered to be groundwater and ecologically based areas of the site, that the impacts were primarily water-based versus maybe different kind of exposure in OU1, and that's why they made that decision at the time.
Oh, okay, thank you. It's been a question forever in my mind.
I have one more question regarding the adverse effect. Can you define what that means? It says 1 in 1 million risk of adverse effect. Is there a definition of adverse effect?
Yes, for that particular threshold value, it's carcinogenic. So that's assessing carcinogenic constituents, so that would actually be, the adverse effect is cancer.
Okay. In all cases, or there might be something?
Well, for those constituents that are not carcinogenic, so in other words, they have not been proven toxicologically to cause cancer, but they could have a different effect on the body. They could have an impact to the kidney or the liver. That threshold, they are evaluated with a different set of equations, but all the equations, all the variables, again, are set by Cal EPA. And that threshold value is 1. So those, and it's to confuse things further, some chemicals are considered both to have the potential to cause cancer and to have the potential to cause non-cancer impacts. So then they would be assessed in both manners. So I would be assessing using one set of equations for chemical A, and come up with a value whether or not there was the potential for a carcinogenic impact, and I would take that same chemical using different equations to determine whether or not it had the potential for non-cancer impacts and assess that against the threshold value of 1.
Just like the lead poisoning, that has no carcinogenic effect, but it can affect the growth of the children, and also adults.
Lead has
kind of chemicals.
Right.
There is a threshold limit on that too, right? Any of those kind of chemicals.
Lead is assessed differently because it has a blood impact that is very deleterious to the development of the brain in children. So Cal EPA has developed a model that's called lead spread. And that model is very conservative. And it determines what the potential blood lead level would be if a child or an adult were exposed to the maximum concentration of lead detected in soil.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So my question is, how many new chemicals have popped up that people have had to go back and remediate? I know I heard of one a couple of years ago or recently. And then how is that done, and who takes... So say it's in a chemical comes up and it's low-cost housing, and people don't have a lot of resources, and how is that handled? And how do the two agencies do it?
Well, the best example is MTBE.
Right.
Okay. So, and the water board was the primary lead agency for gasoline service stations, primarily because underground storage tanks had a history of leaking, and they would impact groundwater. And the water board, their mandate by state law is that all groundwater has the potential to be potable. And they are tasked with protecting potable groundwater. So there were several service stations, hundreds of service stations, that went through the remediation process, received a letter from the water board that indicated that they had achieved the remediation that was necessary. It was a no further action letter. And then MTBE was discovered in groundwater, and the water board actually went back and started looking at these old cases to see if MTBE had ever been sampled. If it had not, then those service station owners or landowners, if the service station was no longer there, if property had changed hands, received a letter from the water board indicating that the case file was being reopened and that they were being mandated to test for MTBE. So it's done based on what is found in future cases, and it's the regulatory agencies that drive it. It's been done for solvents, for the large aerospace industries, both DTSC and the water board. Again, it primarily groundwater has been the driver. And even if DTSC has been the lead agency, they don't give up that status if the constituent impacts groundwater. So groundwater could be impacted on a DTSC site. They could be the lead agency. They could issue closure, and then an additional solvent is found in the aerospace industry, or there have been commingling of plumes. So you might have had one aerospace industry and then miles away another one, but the plumes of the groundwater commingled, and they would go back to make sure they are checking the file to make sure that the constituents of concern in groundwater have been evaluated at both aerospace industries.
So my question also is, if it's low-cost housing and they find something such as this, how do they go about coming up with the funding to remediate it? I mean, it must be remediated. How is it?
Well, the environmental liability rests with the property owner.
The property owner has already sold the property to the new owner.
I mean, we have an example of this right across the street from the Baylands, and that's Midway Village. And Midway Village was built, I don't know how many years ago, 30 years ago or so, and people were living in it. And then it was built, it was determined that the fill that the village was resting on was a contaminant from the PG&E substation next door. And I believe my understanding is since 2009 it has been cleaned up. But I also saw a study that some of the DNA of the people has actually changed. And it, people wanted to move somewhere else. There was no other place to move them. So we actually have an example of a similar situation, very close. And I just was wondering, I think the property moved, was given, there was, it's just very complicated, and I did follow it for a while.
Well, the environmental liability, which would include the financial liability, rests with the property owner.
So the people who own the house, so say if they have a condominium or such, and then the condominium association would have to assume the liability for the cleanup and the payment of the cleanup because something was discovered somewhere around later, and then they would have to do the mitigation and pay for it. Is that correct?
Well, typically, when there is property transfer of sites that would be called brownfields, such as this one, due diligence is done by the lender. It's a requirement of the lender. So all of the historic information would be reviewed by an environmental consultant as part of a phase 1. So the history of the site would be documented. And if it had gone through remediation, that would be the history from phase 1 to phase 2, which is the investigation, to the remediation, would all be documented. The lender's consultants would review it before they would actually move forward with the financial transaction. So there are vehicles, if you are purchasing such property, you could ask to be indemnified by the prior owner. You can, there's insurance that the future purchaser or property purchaser, developer can take out that would cover this event or potential event.
So that would be the homeowner's insurance? I mean, it sounds as though these buildings are going to be more or less multi-unit properties.
I think in this particular case, you can, in the development agreement, you can have a 30 years bond against with the developer. So anything happens, the homeowners will be covered for that period, or whatever period is decided. Am I correct?
There are a number of tools, again, I think I appreciate kind of the historical kind of precedent of a midway, but, we'd be talking about anything in the Baylands would be going forward, the city is part of approving, for example, a condominium has the ability to impose certain conditions of approval that, insurance policies, whatnot, that ensure the ability of that entity to live up to its long-term environmental liability kind of obligations. So I think that's something that when you get to a development proposal that were to subdivide or create a condo, that's the time the city would have the opportunity to explore, what those tools are, whether it's a bond, whether it's an environmental insurance policy.
So that would be set up by the city when is that what you're saying?
The city wouldn't set it up, but the city would want to make sure that it's very clear that the liability runs with that future owner, and that it would be incumbent on that ownership group or that owner to demonstrate they have the financial wherewithal to live up to that obligation over time.
But as my understanding is that at least 20% of this is going to be low cost, is that correct?
That would all be determined through the process, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be condominiumized, that those are going to be units owned. That could be in a rental project, you could have 20% of the, or 25, whatever the proportion is, within a rental project that's owned. They're not individually sold units necessarily.
Right. Because if it's condominium, then there's no equity to pull out of the unit to pay for anything potentially that comes up.
Can I interject?
Sure.
Just to make sure, it's great conversation, great questions. I just want to make sure we cover the presentations. So, and it looks like a lot of the topics that the questions are bringing up are kind of covered in some of these slides. So we can finish the presentation,
Okay.
continue the discussion. I just want to make sure we get all the material in for the public. Thank you.
So the last part of from a remedial standpoint of trying to make sure that the site is safe during construction includes monitoring, and there are various rules from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which would need to be followed by the construction manager. So the rule basically states that if you are excavating or moving soil that has the potential to be impacted by volatile organic compounds, that there would be somebody who would be monitoring this. The monitor is a handheld instrument that would be calibrated on a daily basis every 15 minutes. The professional is taking measurements and recording them on a daily log. There is another rule that says that you must maintain these written records on the property. Then there's another rule that states that the written records must be summarized in a report and submitted to AQMD. And if there's any soil that exceeds the threshold of 50 parts per million by volume of volatiles, that soil would have to be segregated and then removed from the property. And that documentation would also have to be part of the report that would go to the Air Quality Management District. So during the construction itself, which is separate from the remediation, so remediation has already occurred, some environmental professional would be on site monitoring the soil as it's being moved, excavated, and or graded to ensure that no volatile organic compounds are being released from that soil. Additionally, the soil management plan is part of the process. The soil management plan dictates to the construction company what will happen or what they should do if there's soil that they discover while they're doing their OX and grading. And this soil could be soil that exceeds 50 parts per million by volume. It could be odoriferous soil. It could be discolored soil. Again, the concept is that anything that would be found during construction would be mitigated. It would be dealt with. It just would not be something that would be handled on the property. It would be remediated itself, whether that's off the property or however the regulatory agencies chose to do it. And then there are the standard OSHA requirements that need to be followed during the construction itself. Good? Good.
Thank you.
Now I'll try and put all this in a regulatory framework as with city regulations. When you look at, for example, your existing general plan, there was a surprising number of, maybe not surprising, but a number of policies related to site remediation generally and then specific to the Baylands. The two key ones, or a couple ones that I want to point out. One is that remediation is the highest priority, which makes sense. The question also that I think the commission had was, what happens if the remediation never gets certified, and how do the pieces fit together with the regulatory approvals versus your development? You have had a general plan policy now for 22 years that says no approval of development until after approval of the remediation plan. That is your long-standing policy here, that the requirements of the regulatory development approvals are part of your approval process as you get to site-specific development. And specific to the Baylands is general plan policy that every site-specific development must be consistent with compliance with the remediation plan as approved by the regulatory agencies. You have policies dealing with providing risk assessments, which are part of that process, disclosing all of those underlying assumptions, which is also part of the process as we just talked about, and then working with the agencies to make sure of remediation, then the ongoing monitoring. That is what your general plan says now regarding remediation. That was based, of course, by what was known of the process in 1994. The community survey that you had done had a number of questions regarding residential. I'll kind of summarize those results. 55% 5% of the residents of the community would somewhat or strongly oppose housing. 42% would somewhat or strongly support housing. The reasons for opposition: changes in Brisbane's community character, there's more pressing needs for other uses, safety was one of the issues and the reasons for opposition, and then the increased traffic congestion that would come. So that is what we hear out of the community survey. And it was interesting in looking at the survey because the question was that I just talked about, do you support or oppose housing on the Baylands, was then asked a slightly different way. And people were asked, well, there's an existing general plan policy that says no housing on the Baylands. There are about 2,000 houses in Brisbane today. The developer is proposing 4,400 dwelling units. So how many units do you think would be appropriate within the Baylands? And in that case, 43%, the largest number of people responding in any particular category, said no housing. But you had 15% say, well, maybe up to 500 houses. Yeah, another 13% maybe up to 1,000. So this is just information when the question was asked a slightly different way. The sustainability framework has a lot of discussion regarding site remediation, and actually the remediation, the sustainability framework does a really good job discussing the relationship of the potential for residential and site remediation, how they fit together. But some of the key things in the sustainability framework: one, seeking the highest practical standard for site remediation. Two, consulting a credible independent third party, independent of the applicant, for recommendations. Seeking regulatory recommendations for best practices, essentially working through or with the agencies, but providing independent advice, independent comments to the agencies. Installing permanent testing and monitoring. And a key one also is engaging a third-party testing body that would perform regular testing, providing an annual report to the City Council as to what is going on over the long term, and then ensuring a financial mechanism for long-term monitoring. These are just some of the things that are in your sustainability framework. Also in the sustainability framework is the annual testing, and then demonstrating enforceable ongoing financial mechanism to support that annual testing, reporting requirements. So you would ask the question about, how do we know if something will come up later? So rather than just, in the way the sustainability framework works, rather than just waiting for a problem to occur, the sustainability framework suggests there ought to be annual monitoring and testing so that we don't wait for a problem before reacting. The other part of the sustainability framework that is important in this discussion of residential is an interesting statement that there will certainly be differences in standards and applications and expectations that will need to be negotiated with city, developer, and agencies. So a process here of how the city participates with the agencies, and the city being an active participant in the review of remediation, the approval process, the implementation, doing its independent review, city doing its independent review, for example, of the characterization studies being submitted to the regulatory agencies, the city providing its independent comments. We think they are or are not adequate. What is the highest practical standard for remediation based on the kinds of things you just heard, implementing third-party testing, but it sets up a process for the city to independently participate in that process, and at the end, essentially to negotiate if the city is not necessarily in agreement with what occurs. EIR mitigation measure in the hazards section follows that policy that says no approval of development until there is an approved plan. So the process that's laid out in the EIR is the process that we're kind of following in your deliberations right now. One is, the starting point of this process is the city determining what are the appropriate land uses within the Baylands? Because as you saw, the city saying there's a potential for residential in OU1 or OU2 versus not makes a very big difference in the view of the regulatory agencies. What is our cleanup standard? Now, while the regulatory agencies may attempt even in a commercial industrial use to achieve the residential standards, they're not obligated to do so, which they would be obligated to achieve those residential standards on a residential. But it starts with what are the appropriate land uses, and that is your determination. Based on those land uses, and we're talking about a determination ultimately you'll be asked to make at a general plan level. The applicant then prepares remedial action plans to achieve the standards and the process that Dr. Mearns talked about related to the uses that you have determined to be appropriate. The agency's review, eventually the remedial action plans are approved, and in the way that your general plan policy works, the mitigation measure is what the EIR is saying only after the remedial action plans are approved for OU1, OU2, will the city entertain an actual approval of a specific plan for those areas. So I know you've asked about relation of general plan to specific plan, but there's a real key thing. Your own general plan, and this mitigation measure says we'll deal at the general plan level for land uses. Then it goes back to the regulatory agencies and that negotiation process, if that's what it comes to achieve a remedial action plan. Then we'll deal with a specific plan. Then there will be site-specific remediation subject to the regulatory agency's oversight. Then there will be site-specific development. So you would not allow actual site-specific approvals if anybody goes out there doing anything until that process is completed. Now, one of the questions I think you've had and we've thought about is what happens if we decide, okay, we'll consider residential and those residential standards cannot be met, or we simply don't agree with what they're doing. You hold at all times land use authority. And so
who is you? Is
you,
Brisbane?
the city of Brisbane.
Right.
Okay. That is your determination. So partly what we've talked about is, you know, this overall framework.
Wait, look, can
Okay,
you
go
go
ahead.
back and explain that? Is that, wouldn't that, if we decide something and then the city decides that this is not practical or this is not, wouldn't that open the city up to getting sued?
Let me
I just don't understand what
Okay.
you're saying.
I'll lay out when you put all these pieces together the
Okay.
way this framework works, and then that's where we got the attorney over there for questions like that.
Right.
Okay. First step, and you know, when you take your general plan, the sustainability framework, EIR. First step is define the types and intensities of land use. What ought to go where? That is a City of Brisbane determination. You would then, as a city, provide input to the regulatory agencies as they go through their remediation review. You would be using, based on this framework that was laid out in the sustainability framework, even using, on the city side, your own third-party consultants to help you in reviewing what are best practices for testing, best practices for remediating, what is the highest practical standard that we ought to be looking at, reviewing on, as the city, the remediation studies, plans, and actions, providing comments to the regulatory agencies, working with developer and the regulatory agencies to resolve any differences you may have with the conclusions of those regulatory agencies. And then what the sustainability framework suggests is that the city would set up its independent testing, monitoring, and annual report to the city council that then can be your input back to the regulatory agencies and making sure that there is a financial mechanism. Now, the other part of this framework is that ensuring site remediation is in fact completed and approved by the regulatory agencies prior to you approving a specific plan. ensuring that the specific plan is consistent with the approved remediation plans, as well as with your general plan policies. No development within OU2 before, or OU1 before that remediation is completed. No development within OU2 before that remediation is completed. And then when all is said and done, if it turns out to be infeasible to remediate the site to accommodate any particular land use, you can reevaluate, you hold the right to reevaluate those land uses where the cleanup standards cannot be met. And I think the question Commissioner Parker has is to the attorney, to what extent can we say, example, residential it would be an appropriate use. It turns out through the process, as you suggested, that those standards cannot be met, the residential standard cannot be met. Can we then essentially amend the specific plan and say, no, residential will not go there? So, does that make sense?
Commissioners, I mean, obviously there's a lot of sort of hypothetical scenarios that we're sort of tossing around, but I think probably the simplest way to answer the question is that, general plan and specific plan, those are all legislative approvals. That you haven't granted the property owner a particular right to do anything. It's not a permit. It's not site-specific development. You haven't entered into a development agreement, which is a contract. So I think in general, cities can certainly legislate differently. Does that mean that a property owner wouldn't have the right to challenge the city? No, it certainly doesn't. And obviously, somebody can sue the city at any time, should they wish to. But I think in general, at the legislative level, the city retains a great deal of discretion to change directions on its general plan, should that be its desire.
And the way that the general plan policies work now is a site-specific development project would be conditioned on meeting the standards set forth in an approved remediation plan.
Yeah.
Okay. So your condition of approval on a site-specific development would be meet that standard.
Okay. Lloyd, could you just, for me and the public too, just define when you say city, does that, how does the public actually, or is typically represented when you say city, it's back in the city's hand? Is it city council only? Then the public has to go through the city council, or how does that work?
Okay, I think, so when I was talking about the city, that is formerly the city of Brisbane, I think the question for Dr. Mearns is, what would be the public's opportunity for participation in the process beyond the city's formal role, City of Brisbane formal role?
The public's participation in determining a land use, or
reviewing as part of the review of remedial action plans, the characterization. How does the public as a whole participate in the process of the regulatory agencies?
In addition to the City of Brisbane and any third-party consultants that the City of Brisbane would retain, other interest groups and individual members of the public can actually request to be listed as an interested party by both regulatory agencies. And then they can prepare and submit written comments to those regulatory agencies. And the regulatory agencies would then have those on the record.
And so once they're an interested party, what actually happens then?
They would prepare written comments. They would submit the written comments. The written comments would be part of the public record in the regulatory agency's file folder. Actually, anymore, they're online, either GeoTracker or EnviroStore. Regulatory agencies are not mandated to respond to comments generated by interested parties. But this does give a voice to interested parties in the process.
Okay. Yeah, just trying to define, like what you were saying is, how can the public represent themselves after the fact if there's a disagreement between the city and the owner? How can we get back in? It's not through this formal process again. So, how much does the public, are they relying solely on the city council to represent the city at that point?
It would be comments from members of the public directly to the regulatory agencies.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
So now we'll move to other issues because there actually are some. First thing in terms of other issues besides the remediation, General Plan Policy 330.1 today, and has since the adoption of the General Plan, prohibits housing within the Baylands. That is your policy as it exists today. The applicant has applied for an amendment to the general plan that would remove that prohibition. The applicant has absolutely the right to apply for that removal of that prohibition. You, as the Planning Commission, ultimately the City Council, have an obligation to consider the request. But ultimately, your recommendation and the council's decision, you're not obligated to approve or not approve. Okay. As you look through the sustainability framework, the regional plans for achieving greenhouse gas reduction, you see that residential use in close proximity to housing has a role in the sustainability of communities. The sustainability framework itself, as the city went through, your committee went through a lot of work on this, does not preclude housing in the Baylands. It doesn't say, yep, we're going to have housing, nor does it say there will not be housing, but it does include provisions related to how housing would be part of sustainable development within the Baylands if ultimately you would recommend to the council and council agrees to have residential or housing within the Baylands. Basically, the provision of housing and proximity to jobs tends to reduce average commutes. Nobody can guarantee that people will live and work in the same place, but as a whole, the closer jobs are related to each other, jobs and housing related to each other, the average commutes are less. Today in Brisbane, you have far more jobs than you have workers living in the city. 4 or 5 to 1 more people. And so basically, as you look at the Baylands and that, do we include housing, don't we include housing? Adding substantially more employment without adding housing will tend to increase the average commutes because there just isn't enough housing locally for that close relationship. There were a number of questions earlier about...
There's a question regarding that. Go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
You said the adding more employment in the absence of adding housing will tend to increase average commutes. That's subject to the affordability of housing itself. Even though there might be a lot of housing available, people cannot afford it, then there's going to be the same problem. Right now, the rental market is such that people are even working in San Francisco that has a lot of rental units, but they are moving out of San Francisco.
Absolutely.
So
One of the issues...
This is a very generalized...
It's a general statement. Because one of the things you can see, and people who live out in Pleasanton, Livermore, know this really well, how far people will go to afford a home, to buy a house.
Yeah.
And so it is averages, but the one thing that you really can't get to is that how do you match employment wages to housing costs, because in the Bay Area, your housing market in the Bay Area is just so skewed with prices. So really we're just talking about the overall average. The issue just on the grand level for the...
But this may be true in areas like Texas and other states where you may have the affordability factor is not there. But in Bay Area, that's the most predominant factor. People cannot afford. So
Let me
even
put
if
it
you
as a,
even if you provide tons of housing, if there is no, they cannot afford it, they're not going to leave.
picture the Bay Area as a whole. So here's the 9 counties. There are far more jobs in the Bay Area, or more jobs in the Bay Area, than there are workers. So where do workers come from?
Right.
Your 9 counties, or our 9 counties in the Bay Area, import labor. They import it from Gilroy South, coming up.
It's continue to happen.
You import it from Tracy in, and from surrounding the Bay Area comes in. So if you just take the Bay Area as a whole, we won't even worry about any individual place. Adding jobs in the Bay Area, adding more jobs in the Bay Area than any project adds housing, those workers got to come from somewhere. And given the high prices, they're likely going to, they come from farther and farther out. So when we're talking about averages, it's really that kind of thing. Now, one of the questions you had raised earlier in public hearings was that question about how many people are really going to walk or bike to work. So I took a look at the 2010 census. Right now, or in 2010, 6% of the people, Brisbane workers, so Brisbane residents who are in the employment market, who are in the job market, 6% of the people living in Brisbane reported walking or biking to work. About 12% reported taking transit to work. That's pretty consistent with the numbers that we used in terms of internal capture within the Baylands. And by putting more jobs and housing in proximity, given that caveat, depending on how well they really match in terms of wages and cost of housing, that can increase the ability to walk to work, bike to work, and so on. But under any circumstances, just that need to keep importing labor into the Bay Area, that mismatch not only of cost, just sheer numbers. You have some of the longest commutes around, even as long as Los Angeles. It's really spread out because you're having to import labor from a distance that results in energy consumption, air pollutants, emissions, and GHG emissions. Question also came up, and we heard in earlier hearings about. Go ahead.
Can I just? So there's a housing development that is right next to the Baylands that is just going to be housing, as far as I know. So can we factor that into this? Because they can just walk pretty much down the street to get jobs in the Baylands.
Perfect. Yeah. So here's the next thing I looked at was exactly that question. Is when you take the Bayview, Hunters Point, Candlestick Point, planned development, priority development area, and the San Francisco portion of that bi-county. So people have said 10,000 jobs. Actually, when you put all those projects together, it's going to be, or 10,000 housing units, it's going to be more like 16,000 housing units. But they're not purely residential projects. So just those projects are going to generate about 10,000 new jobs. So yeah, there's some excess of housing. When you look at all of the city of San Francisco, all of Daly City, Brisbane, South San Francisco, the projections from ABAG show about 104,000 new dwelling units. That's a lot. But on the other hand, 210,000, nearly 210,000 new jobs being created at the same time, which means about those new jobs will require about 100, figuring that there's more than one worker per household. So in the 4 cities of this area, a shortage of about 30,000 dwelling units, 30,000, even if all of these new workers lived in the 4 cities, about 30,000 of them are going to have to commute in from somewhere. All of this, well, I'll say this way. The decision and the recommendation you make, whether there is or is not a shortage of housing, that's really not the question for you. You can see these numbers. As a professional looking at it, I would say, yeah, there's a shortage of housing in the Bay Area. We all know that. The question for you as a community, you as a planning commission, ultimately city council, is not, is there a housing shortage? The question is this an appropriate site? So let's talk about some of the other impacts. Effects on community character. One is the high-density nature of the residential proposed on the Baylands, multifamily attached units, an urban, very urban setting, is going to be very different than what your existing neighborhoods are. They're much more suburban, low density. Residential in the Baylands is going to be physically separated from residential elsewhere in the community. But there's really not a clear way of quantifying the question of how cohesive will the community be when you have two different styles, very different styles of housing, physically separated. We can't really know that question. And we'll talk about the intensity and scale of any permitted development, any permitted use in future meetings. The last issue I just wanted to bring up in terms of housing is the cost revenue picture, what this really means for the city. Throughout California, we've all heard this, residential does not typically pay for itself. Typical home, although none of us like thinking of it, we take more out of cities in services than we're giving to them in taxes, no matter how much high we think our taxes are. So the cost to the city of providing services to housing are generally going to exceed the revenues that we get from housing. And that's just purely housing. Now, on the other hand, when we have retail, which is where most cities really get their money, if nobody's living around anywhere around the commercial, there's no sales tax, so you've got to factor that in. The fiscal studies are being completed, but there's nothing showing up in those that says the typical pattern of housing not paying for itself is going to be any different in the Baylands than anywhere else.
And what is that?
What do you mean, what I'm sorry?
Well, we don't see any numbers.
Now, the basic proposition is housing will generate more cost to the city than it will generate revenue. And what that, because
But we don't know,
How much?
we don't have a ballpark at all.
no, we don't.
Not at all.
It's going to be more.
It's going to be more by a factor of 2, by a factor of 1. I just don't.
It's typically, statewide, a lot of cities will be 20 to 30% more. And depending on how much retail you have in your community, and whether you have the sales tax generating uses, in some communities, the sales tax generation out of those houses makes up for that deficit. So there's ways of changing land use to balance things out. But the basic proposition is all of us in our houses, I shouldn't say all of us, because
And that includes the schools and everything? The
schools
and the added police and the added,
for the city.
it runs about 20%.
Yeah, I think if I was going to look at a number statewide, it's about a 20% deficit. And then cities that capture nearly all of the sales tax generated out of those houses, they're breaking even, coming out ahead. Cities that are importing sales tax are coming out ahead. But in a lot of communities, depending on how much you have in terms of office, industrial use, hotels, that's really what's paying for some of these cities that have a lot of housing. There's cities, for example, one I know of in the Central Valley has very little retail, but has a large industrial base. It's one of the financially more secure cities in the Central Valley where they're all getting massacred, just because of some of those industries are point of sale, but the property tax being generated in industrial use, and there's some hospitality. There's other ways of making money. But when you isolate just the house, about a 20% deficit. So with that, that's kind of where we are on all of this. And so it's now your part.
Great.
So, yeah, I'll turn it back to you
Time for
for
a little
your
break.
deliberation unless there's any other
Yeah.
questions.
Well, thank you for
Thank you.
both of you for your presentations. And yeah, may we take a break? Like 5 minutes, please. Thank you.